Do you remember that famous speech from the 1987 movie Wall Street? The scene where Michael Douglas...
He's playing Gordon Gecko.
Right, the slick, tailored corporate predator. He stands up at that shareholder meeting, and he basically declares to this room full of applause that greed, for lack of a better word, is good.
I mean, it is arguably one of the most iconic moments in cinema history. It completely crystallized all the financial excess of the 1980s into, just a single sentence.
It really did. But what a lot of people don't realize is that Gordon Gecko wasn't just some over-the-top Hollywood invention.
No, not at all.
He was heavily inspired by a very real, incredibly ruthless capitalist, and that is the subject of our deep dive today. We are looking at billionaire investor Carl Icahn.
This is a wild one.
It is. We've got a massive stack of sources today. Biographical profiles, financial analyses, historical retrospectives on his biggest deals, and opinion pieces. Our mission is to really unpack the mind, the methods, and, honestly, the multi-billion-dollar mistakes of the man who practically invented the hostile takeover.
Yeah, the original corporateraider.
Exactly. We're going to figure out how he reshaped corporate America and what his legendary wins and massive losses can teach you about the actual nature of wealth creation.
And it's such an incredible trajectory because, to understand how someone becomes an apex predator in the corporate boardroom, you really have to look at how they first learn to evaluate risk.
Right.
How they dismantle arguments.
Right.
And his origin story is completely unexpected.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because he wasn't born into Wall Street royalty. Carl Icahn was born in 1936 in Queens, New York, to an Ashkenazi Jewish family.
Just a totally normal background.
Yeah, his mother was a school teacher. His father was a cantor at the local synagogue. But, and this is key, he was also a sworn atheist.
See, that detail alone tells you so much about the household dynamic.
Right.
You have a father who makes his living singing religious liturgy, but privately completely rejects the fundamental premise of it. There's a strict separation between outward tradition and, cold internal belief.
Absolutely. And Icahn was clearly a brilliant kid. He ends up going to Princeton University, graduating in 1957.
With a degree in philosophy, of all things.
Yes, and I actually have to read the title of his senior thesis, because it sounds like a literal joke about academic jargon.
Oh, let's hear it.
It was called, quote, "The Problem of Formulating an Adequate Explication of the Empiricist Criterion of Meaning."
Wow. Yeah, it is a massive mouthful.
It really is.
But if we break down what that thesis actually argues, it honestly becomes the blueprint for his entire career.
How so?
Well, the empiricist criterion of meaning essentially states that a statement only has value, it only has actual meaning if it can be verified through direct observation or hard logic.
So if you can't prove it with empirical data.
It's just meaningless noise.
Yeah.
Sentiment, tradition, gut feelings, none of that matters to him.
So basically, he approaches the stock market like a hybrid of a really rigorous philosophy debate and a high-stakes poker game. He's entirely unemotional. He's only looking for the empirical weakness in a company's hand, and then he ruthlessly exploits it.
And, the poker part of your analogy is surprisingly literal here.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because after Princeton, he went to NYU Medical School, mostly just to please his mother, but he dropped out after 2 years.
He just didn't like it.
He didn't have the passion for medicine. So he joined the Army. And while he's in the Army, he isn't exactly, shining his boots and following orders.
Oh, what's he doing?
He's playing poker in the barracks.
Of course he is.
A staggering amount of poker. He actually won thousands of dollars playing against his fellow soldiers. He learned very quickly how to calculate the odds, read the table, and completely detach his emotions from the money in front of him.
And I'm guessing that became his seed money.
Exactly. He eventually took those exact poker winnings to bankroll his move to Wall Street. He bought a seat on the New York Stock Exchange in 1968.
Okay, so that transition from the barracks straight into the boardroom, that is where things get really dangerous for corporate America.
Very dangerous.
He takes that clinical empiricist philosophy, combines it with his poker face, and starts testing out a strategy that would eventually terrify the establishment.
Yeah.
And the first real test of that playbook happened in 1978.
Right, with a company called Tappan.
Yeah, tell us about Tappan.
So Tappan was a manufacturer of household appliances, stoves, ovens, that sort of thing.
Real exciting stuff.
Right, it was a perfectly boring company. But the economic climate of the 1970s is crucial here. Stock prices were heavily depressed across the board.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning a lot of these boring companies were actually worth more dead than alive. Their real estate and their cash reserves were worth more than what their stock price reflected on the open market.
Oh, wow. So how does Icahn capitalize on that? Because I know SEC rules dictate that once you own 5% of a publicly traded company, you have to formally disclose it to the government, right?
I've heard.
And to the public.
Yeah.
So I assume he had to sneak up right to that edge.
That's exactly what he did. He started quietly buying up Tappan stock using borrowed money, what we call leverage.
Right.
He would buy just enough to get to 4.9%, staying totally under the radar.
Just lurking there.
Exactly. And the moment he crossed that 5% threshold, he filed the paperwork, effectively jumping out of the bushes. He demanded a seat on the board of directors and immediately ordered the company to be liquidated or sold to the highest bidder.
Okay, wait, let me push back on this.
Sure.
If you're an everyday investor, or say I'm an employee at Tappan, building stoves on the line, some guy buys a tiny fraction of my company using a bank loan, and suddenly he gets to dictate the entire future of the business.
Yeah.
He can just force a sale. How is this not just legal corporate extortion? Why should you or anyone be okay with this?
Well, you've hit on the exact controversy that defined his whole career. Icahn's argument was always that the management of these companies had grown bloated. They were lazy and completely overly compensated.
The executives, you mean?
Right. They were flying on private jets while the stock price languished. Because he was strictly empirical, he looked at the math and said, the shareholders are being robbed by incompetent leadership.
So he saw himself as kind of a hero.
He saw himself as a champion, unlocking true value. And in Tappan's case, he forced a sale to a company called Electrolux for $2.8 million. He doubled his initial investment almost overnight.
But he didn't stop at just forcing sales, right? He evolved this strategy into something much darker. He started utilizing a tactic called Greenmail.
Yeah, Greenmail. It's a play on the word blackmail, obviously, and it is a fascinating psychological maneuver.
How does it work?
Icahn would buy his 5% or 10% stake in a target company, make a massive amount of public noise, and threaten a hostile takeover. He would basically threaten to fire all the top executives.
And the management gets so terrified of losing their corner offices and their salaries that they panic.
They panic completely, and they use the company's own treasury, meaning the shareholders' money, to buy Icahn's shares back from him at a massive premium.
Wait, really?
Oh, yeah. They pay him millions over market value just to make him sign a contract promising to go away.
That is wild.
Yeah.
They are paying him a ransom using their own investors' money purely for self-preservation.
It was perfectly legal at the time, though obviously highly criticized. Icahn recognized that corporate boards cared more about their own jobs than the company's long-term health. That was the empirical weakness he exploited.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The tap-in deal and those early Greenmail plays, they were really just a warm-up.
Oh, absolutely.
In 1985, he took this exact playbook and scaled it up to a massive, iconic American brand. This is the deal that truly defined him as the ultimate corporate raider. We're talking about the hostile takeover of Transworld Airlines, or TWA.
Right. This was a monumental shift in scale. TWA was a global aviation giant. Icahn acquired 50% of TWA and eventually completed a leveraged buyout in LBO for $470 million.
We should define that, because a leveraged buyout sounds highly technical, but the reality is pretty brutal.
It's very brutal.
I mean, it's like buying a historic, beautiful mansion, but you take out a massive mortgage to do it. Then, to pay yourself back, you strip out all the copper wiring, you sell the vintage doors, you take off the roof, and you just leave the bank holding the bag on a collapsing shell of a house.
That is a brutally accurate metaphor for what we call asset stripping. Because it was an LBO, Icahn borrowed against TWA's own assets to buy the airline. He saddled TWA with $540 million in new debt.
$500 million in debt.
Yeah. And to pay down that debt, he started selling off the airline's crown jewels. For example, he sold TWA's highly profitable London routes to American Airlines for $445 million.
But the truly Shakespearean irony here is how he won the bid in the first place.
Oh, the unions.
Right. To get control of TWA, he actually formed an alliance with the airline's unions, the pilots and the machinists.
And the context there is critical. The unions were terrified of a rival bidder named Frank Lorenzo.
Why were they scared of him?
Lorenzo had a notorious reputation in the aviation industry for pushing airlines into bankruptcy, specifically to void union contracts and slash wages.
So Icahn walks in and presents himself as the lesser of two evils.
Precisely. He convinced the unions to take massive wage cuts in exchange for a 20% stake in TWA's stock and a share of the profits. They actually thought they were partnering with a tough but fair investor who would save the airline.
Instead, he used the workers to help him buy the company, and then he dismantled it right around them.
Exactly.
I mean, TWA struggled for years under the crushing weight of the debt he put on them. They filed for bankruptcy in 1992 and then finally collapsed for good in 2001 when American Airlines absorbed whatever was left. The airline was completely destroyed.
The airline died. But Icahn walked away with a personal profit estimated at up to $1 billion.
$1 billion from a company he drove into bankruptcy.
Yeah.
It's no wonder that after TWA, the term corporateraider became incredibly toxic.
Yeah.
Moving into the 2000s, he realizes he needs an image overhaul. He starts calling himself an activist shareholder.
Right. The language softens significantly. Activism implies you're, fixing a broken system. But the underlying tactics remained incredibly aggressive.
They didn't really change at all.
Not really. And as his targets grew from appliance makers and airlines into massive tech companies, we start to see a fundamental flaw in his empirical philosophy, especially when you contrast him with other titans of the financial world.
That flaw really gets exposed during his epic billionaire feuds. Let's talk about his all-out war with Bill Ackman over the nutritional supplement company Herbalife.
Oh, this was pure theater on Wall Street.
Yeah.
Bill Ackman, who is another famous and very aggressive investor, took a massive $1 billion short position against Herbalife.
Let's explain how a short position works mechanically for anyone who doesn't know, because it's the exact opposite of normal investing.
Yeah, it's betting against a company.
Right. Instead of buying a stock hoping it goes up, Ackman borrowed millions of shares of Herbalife, sold them at the current price, and was just waiting for the stock to crash. His plan was to buy those shares back at rock bottom, return the borrowed shares, and pocket the difference. He was literally betting $1 billion that the company would fail. He was publicly calling them an illegal pyramid scheme.
And that is exactly when Carl Icahn steps in. Not because he had a deep fundamental belief in the value of nutritional shakes, but because he and Bill Ackman had a bitter, long-standing personal feud.
Wait, really? It was personal?
Completely personal. Icahn saw an opportunity to trap Ackman, so Icahn started aggressively buying up Herbalife stock, eventually acquiring a 21% stake.
Wow. And by buying up all those shares, Icahn artificially reduces the supply of the stock available on the market.
Which forces the price to skyrocket.
Right. And because Ackman eventually has to buy shares to cover his short position, he is bleeding money every single time the price goes up.
It's called a short squeeze, and it was devastatingly effective. After 5 years of public insults and financial warfare, Ackman finally threw in the towel and took a massive loss. Icahn walked away with a $1.3 billion profit simply for squeezing his rival.
So, if you are listening to this, you have to ask yourself, what does this actually mean for you, for the broader economy? If Icahn is making $1 billion on Herbalife, is he actually fixing a broken company and bringing value to the market? Or is he just winning a billionaire measuring contest?
Right. Is the market genuinely better off with apex predators like him keeping executives awake at night?
Exactly.
That is the defining debate of his legacy, and the best way to understand the limitations of his approach is to contrast him with someone like Warren Buffett.
Okay.
They are both incredibly successful, obviously, but their worldviews are polar opposites. Carl Icahn is fundamentally a short-term pessimist. Warren Buffett is a long-term optimist.
Oh, and this ties perfectly back to his Princeton philosophy thesis on empiricism. Icahn only believes in the hard numbers right in front of him. If he can't measure it today, he doesn't trust it.
That is exactly right. Let's look at his trades with the tech giants. Icahn bought heavily into Netflix in 2012 and Apple in 2013.
Good moves.
Very good moves. He made billions flipping both of them. But he sold his Netflix shares after just a few years, securing a $2 billion profit. He sold his Apple shares in 2016, citing immediate fears about a slowdown in the Chinese market, taking another $2 billion profit.
I mean, most people would be thrilled with a $2 billion profit.
Sure.
Until they look at what happened to those companies over the next decade.
Right. Because of his pessimism, his constant empirical fear that the good numbers couldn't last, and his inability to price in future innovation, he got out entirely too early. Warren Buffett, on the other hand, is famously a massive long-term holder of Apple.
He just holds on to it.
He trusts the underlying engine of the business to weather short-term storms. If Icahn had just held those shares like Buffett did, it's estimated he left $5 billion on the table with Netflix and an astonishing $3.7 billion on the table with Apple.
Oh my gosh. He cost himself nearly $9 billion simply because he couldn't stop looking over his shoulder. He fundamentally couldn't trust a good company to just keep growing.
And around the same time, his visibility brought him into the political sphere. In 2016, Carl Icahn endorsed Donald Trump for president.
And we need to be absolutely clear. Here we are remaining strictly neutral in the politics. We're not taking sides. We are simply reporting the factual timeline of his career as outlined in our sources.
Right. This is purely about how his business interest intersected with his advisory role. Following the election, he briefly served as a special advisor to the president on regulatory reform.
Okay.
But because he wasn't officially a federal employee, he was not required to relinquish his massive business interests.
Which obviously raises immediate questions about whose interests are actually being served.
It triggered significant ethics flags. The primary conflict of interest cited was his 82% ownership of a company called CVR Energy, which is a petroleum refiner.
Oh.
Yeah. Critics pointed out that giving advice on environmental and regulatory reform while majority owning an oil refiner was highly problematic, as changing those regulations would directly impact his personal wealth.
It's a huge conflict.
Ultimately, under mounting scrutiny, he stepped down from the advisory role in August 2017, stating he didn't want to become a distraction to the administration.
But stepping away from Washington didn't save him from his own worst instincts, did it? Because as we move past 2017, that deep-seated pessimism we talked about with Apple, it starts to snowball. It really proves that even the sharpest predators can eventually bleed in the water.
It does. This brings us to a historic $9 billion mistake.
Wow.
From 2017 onward, Icahn took massive short positions against the broader market. He was absolutely convinced a catastrophic crash was imminent.
But the market didn't crash.
No, it just kept steadily rising. He eventually admitted in an interview with the Financial Times that he lost $9 billion betting against the American economy. He actually acknowledged that he failed to adhere to his own advice that you cannot pick the market on a short-term basis.
But losing money on a bad bet is one thing. The ultimate twist in this story, the moment where the hunter truly becomes the hunted, happens in May of 2023. A short seller group releases a brutal, highly public report. And their target wasn't some mismanaged appliance company.
No.
The target was Icahn's own company, Icahn Enterprises.
A younger generation of financial attackers called Hindenburg Research published a devastating analysis. They claimed that Icahn Enterprises was vastly overvalued. But the mechanism of their attack was brilliant. They accused Icahn of paying out unsustainably high dividends to his shareholders.
Wait, why would he pay out dividends he couldn't afford?
Because paying an artificially high dividend makes the stock incredibly attractive to retail investors, which keeps the stock price continuously inflated.
Okay, but why does he need the price inflated?
Because he had taken out a massive margin loan from Morgan Stanley.
Okay. We need to explain this because a margin loan is basically a house of cards. A margin loan means you use your own stock as collateral to borrow hard cash from a bank.
Right.
But there's a catch. If the price of your stock plummets, the collateral is suddenly worthless. The bank issues a margin call, demanding their money back instantly, which forces you to sell your stock at rock bottom to pay them, crashing the price even further in a total death spiral.
That is the exact trap Hindenburg exposed. They argued he was using money from new investors to pay the high dividends to keep the stock propped up.
Which kind of sounds like a Ponzi scheme.
It functionally resembles the structure of one, yeah. And the market reaction to this report was violent. On the first day alone, Icahn Enterprises stock plummeted 20%. It eventually dropped 40%.
So his margin loan is suddenly in critical danger.
Exactly. To stop Morgan Stanley from calling in the loan and collapsing his entire empire, Icahn was forced to pump nearly $4 billion of his own money into the firm just to stabilize the stock.
The irony is breathtaking. The man who made his fortune rating companies, dissecting their balance sheets to expose their empirical weaknesses.
He gets raided.
He gets raided and exposed by a younger firm using his exact brand of ruthless analysis.
He lived by the sword of empirical financial attack for 50 years, and in 2023, he took a devastating blow from that exact same sword.
So what does this entire journey leave us with? We've tracked him from the philosophy student formulating logic puzzles at Princeton, to the poker player cleaning out his barracks, to the most feared corporate raider of the 1980s, stripping TWA down to the studs.
Right.
And finally, to a bruised billionaire facing the multi-billion-dollar consequences of his own pessimism.
For you listening, Carl Icahn's story is really a masterclass in the sheer mechanical power of leverage and corporate pressure. But his later years serve as a stark warning. The contrast with Warren Buffett highlights the incredible wealth-generating power of long-term optimism versus the exhausting, very expensive nature of short-term pessimism.
It really does.
Most importantly, it draws a very thin, very sharp line between actively creating value for a company and simply extracting its value for yourself.
It is a cautionary tale of extraction. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final, deeply contradictory fact to chew on.
Oh, this is my favorite part.
In 2022, Carl Icahn, the ultimate cutthroat capitalist, the man who fired thousands of airline workers, the literal inspiration for Gordon Gecko's greed is good. He launched a proxy fight against McDonald's.
And a proxy fight means he bought a tiny amount of shares and then aggressively campaigned to convince the big institutional shareholders to give him their voting power so he could force a change on the board of directors. But he didn't do this to force a sale or to strip McDonald's of its real estate asset.
Not at all. He bought exactly 200 shares of McDonald's and went to war with their board of directors because he wanted to force the company to improve the living conditions of the pigs raised by their pork suppliers.
He was specifically campaigning for them to end the use of gestation crates, which are these incredibly confining, inhumane metal cages used for pregnant pigs.
Wow.
Only 1% of the shareholders supported his nominees, and he ultimately lost the fight. But it leaves you with a profound sense of mystery. At the end of a lifetime built on the philosophy that human sentiment is meaningless and only hard numbers matter.
Yeah.
What truly motivates a man who already has all the money in the world to suddenly spend his twilight years going to war for animal rights?
That is a contradiction that empiricism alone simply cannot answer.